Hello and welcome to Dateline New Haven. I'm your host, Paul Bass, inviting you to look behind the headlines on the stories that make our community tick. Today we have an author who doesn't live in New Haven. He lives in Minneapolis, and I believe he might be in Ireland right now. Are you in Ireland?
I am.
All right, but he's got something I think everyone in New Haven would be interested in reading, especially if you're into music, literary fiction, relationship stories, and good writing. The book is called No Names. It's just out on Coffee House Press. Greg Hewett is the author, and he's here with us today from Ireland. Welcome, Mr. Hewett, and thanks so much for coming on the air with us.
Thanks for having me. It's great to be here.
So what are you doing in Ireland?
Well, I have 15 students with me from Carleton College, where I teach, and it's a summer session that we have here studying spirituality in place and then creative writing in place with contemporary authors visiting us as well.
Do you go to any metal bands?
Not here. Not here so far. I mean, I'm in the countryside, so we've seen some great traditional, Irish music. It's great at every pub.
I love the pubs. My wife and I were there a year ago. I just love the music in the pubs. It's just, it's so comfortable and fun and lively. And
I had a student last time who brought her violin along, and she went to a pub with us, and they said, "Yeah, come on up." And they're just very inviting people, and she played away with them all night.
and it's a great sense of community there. But struck me on a very side note was I thought it was all going to be about Guinness and dark beer, but what I really loved there were the ales. I thought they had some great dark ales and red ales.
They do. They do.
Anyway, you've written this book, No Names. I loved reading it. I really got lost in it just because it touched on a lot of things I'm kind of interested in. But it's a story that takes place in two periods, 1978 when punk hit and then new wave, and then 93. 78 is when this band has its moment when it's about to explode, and then it collapses in this very dramatic way about the relationship between the two leaders of the band, the teenagers Mike and Pete. And then in 1993, when a young man discovers them in an old record of theirs and goes on a journey to try to meet them and what happens there. And there's a third story about the relationship between a classical musician who befriends them. One thing that I kept wondering when I read this book was the challenge of writing about music in prose. And then when I saw that you're a poet, you've had 5 volumes of poetry published. You've had this long, successful career, Fulbright, teaching. And what are you, 67 or 68, correct?
7, yeah.
67. At this age, you write your first novel. And you write a novel that's about the power of music in relationships. What made you decide to do that at this stage in your life? And by the way, congratulations on that, finding a new trick.
Yeah, no, it was funny. It's in some ways I am a poet, but I started out thinking about novels, and I actually had a mentorship with Toni Morrison years ago.
Wow.
Right just before she won the Pulitzer Prize at Albany, at the State University there, and before she went to Princeton. And so I wrote a novel with her, and it was awesome and fun. And then
you wrote the novel with her?
Not that novel, no, another novel.
So you've written another novel before?
Right, but what happened was I started writing poetry, and then I sent the novel out, and 2 agents said, "Oh, this is really good." And this was written a long time ago. They said in the early 90s, and they said, "But no one's interested in the 70s."
Wow.
Then lo and behold, like a year later, there was a TV program that came out called
That 70s Show
with Ashton Kutcher. So I was like, okay. But at that point, I had just, gone into poetry and not written it. And then this story just came to me kind of more urgently. And I think that people always tell you never write about music, right?
I stink at it. Like I sometimes will cover music. I'm a news reporter, but I love music so much. And when in the 70s and early 80s, I used to go to the punk shows and write about new wave, and never was any good at it. I found it very hard to capture in prose what music's like.
Yeah, and so I think so it was risky in that way. But then a friend of mine who's a novelist, Janice Agee, she looked at it and she said, "You write about music really well," and so that pushed me forward. I was like, okay, maybe it's not such a calamity to be writing about.
Well, just so I got it straight, this is different from the novel you wrote in the 90s. What
Yeah,
happened to that
yeah.
novel that you shelved?
It's in the shelf somewhere. Yeah, I mean it's probably on a floppy disk if you remember
I
those.
remember I tried to write a novel that was on a floppy disk. I was really glad it
So,
disintegrated because it
so,
wasn't very good. Yeah.
yeah, I think it's on a floppy disk. There's probably a hard copy in my.
What was it about in the 70s?
Um, it wasn't that interesting in the sense that it was about three young architects and a monk of all things, and it was about a lot about building, what it means to take an old building and make it new, and then in the same breath about their relationships. I mean, taking an old relationship and making it new, and so it was. Yeah, it was about architecture.
Well, the elevator description is quite good. It's something I think a lot of people would have read in the pandemic. Is it worth brushing off, or do you think it was you just getting your sea legs?
Getting my sea legs. I might take a look at it again. I'm in the process of writing a second novel now, so I'm not sure if I'll go back to that one. I mean, a third novel, I suppose you would say, but
So you didn't write. So from early 90s, fast forward 30 something years, you had not written a novel. You became a poet and a professor.
exactly.
So what made you want to come back and do this book as a novel?
It just came. It seemed urgent. What happened was a childhood friend of mine, my best friend. I hadn't. We stopped being friends in high school because he became kind of a tough guy and an athlete both, and I became kind of a nerd. And and I found out a few years ago, like we were like in our late 50s, that he died of a heroin overdose.
Mm.
And that just triggered so much in me about our past and
Had you
how
played
that.
music together?
No, his brother had a band, so the whole thing is fictional. My story is fictional, but his brother did have a band that flashed in the pan, as it were, in New York. We were from Ithaca, upstate, and it flashed in the pan in New York. So those all, and mainly the reason I wanted to write about punk was because it was one of those things I desired, but I never was a part of. Because, back in the day, to become punk wasn't just like, oh, a style or a lifestyle. It was a commitment in the 70s. It was like changing your life. And then,
True. I never did either, but I was kind of touched, especially by the new wave offshoot of it. To go to the shows was fun, even if you weren't a punk, and do that with your hair.
well, the main interesting thing about it all is I was traveling around Europe for 3 months before studying abroad when I was 19 for a whole year. And I met this wonderful Italian girl she's in the acknowledgments in the end. I don't even know her name anymore. And she was far cooler than I was. And we were a month together in London. And I was like, why are you interested in hanging with me? I'm such wearing like overalls and, that kind of stuff. And she took me to punk shows that are now famous, like the Buzzcocks, Susie and the Banshees, the Boys, the Dead Boys. I mean, all these things. And I was shocked. I didn't know anything about it, but I loved it. Fast forward a few months, at the end of that year, I went back to the States and I met a guy who was studying to be an opera singer, and he hated punk. And I was playing Patti Smith's Horses, and he came in the room and knocked the needle across the record and destroyed it. And then his brother, actually, this is tying in.
Yeah.
His brother, I didn't know, was a heroin addict, and so he saw the cover of Blondie's Parallel Lines with Debbie Harry having a tourniquet on her arm.
Mm.
And he flipped out and broke that record too. I mean,
Well, you had some financial setbacks with this relationship, huh?
right. So anyway, so punk was lost to me, and I always sort of regretted and desired it. And then the other facet of the book about things you'd never have, I always thought I would live in the Faroe Islands forever. Lived there for 2 short periods of time, and so it's about things that I didn't do in many ways. The novel.
What's interesting to me when I hear you talk, Greg, is in the book, so much of what you experience comes through not in any literal way,
right?
But everything from those are very compelling and hard scenes in this book when the use of heroin in Amsterdam and the death of one of the people with a heroin overdose. But also you talk about the islands that were important to you, the music that was important to you. So later in life, in that stage we're at now in our 60s, I think that those teenage years, especially late teenage years and early 20s, are so intense that many years happen within a year, and they're so formative. and the emotions never leave, and you're always reprocessing them. And I wonder if in this book, your first published novel, the first one you wrote in decades, was partly a way of processing all these different strands of what you experienced then about music, about peripheral exposure to heroin overdoses, to the islands.
Yeah. Yeah, no, it was definitely one.
I got you on the couch now.
It was definitely wanting, but I was never interested, and I've never been interested in writing an autobiographical novel or autofiction, and so it really is fiction. And the key, I think, to it was that gave it some plot was Isaac, the young, the 18-year-old who finds it in his mom's attic, their one record in the 90s, and that just kind of was especially good because it made it not autobiographical. It gave it this idea of his desire for that band.
Well, that's the trick, right? A lot of people write their big novel about their life and they make it so literal. They lose story, they lose character, they lose development because the aim is to process what they went through or tell their side of their story, as opposed to the trick of the novels taking us to reality within suspended disbelief, where none of this actually happened, but you believe it kind of happened. It's a form because of what you experienced. Anyway, that's a long way of just saying No Names is a very interesting novel Greg Hewett has out, as we said, we're talking about here on Dateline New Haven. How did you decide on the structure of the book? So this book toggles back and forth from 1978 when Mike and Pete formed the band and this real kind of dead town, working class kids. They decide they have this incredible power with the punk music. It brings them to the brink of fame. It brings them to Europe. They make this one record and then it's all over and it disappears and no one's heard of them. And then in that same place in Washington State in 93, Isaac, the teenager, discovers the record. He's lost kid. He finds that sort of secret, when you discover a record, not everybody knows about, only kind of insiders like the guy who runs his record shop. That's kind of powerful. How did you decide to have the story unfold by going back and forth from 1978 to 1993?
No, it's actually not Washington State.
I'm sorry.
It's a fictitious state somewhere in the upper Midwest, probably.
Oh, I'm sorry. I thought, yeah.
No, don't be sorry. It because it's an unnamed place in America. I want to say that it came about organically. I started writing, and then I realized, and maybe this has to do with those lyric moments, I felt that their consciousnesses needed to be juxtaposed with each other. That is, the young man in the 1990s and these teenagers in the 70s. I felt they needed to be almost I think juxtaposed time and time again, because the one are very working class boys in the 70s, and he's an upper middle class boy in the 90s, and I just wanted those two, and then I threw in
classical.
Classical, and that was again something. I always wanted to be a classical pianist when I was young, but to quote Sylvia Plath, my touch was oddly wooden, so that never panned out. So having Daniel as one of the narrators, these three first-person narrators, the young guy in the 90s, the one guy in the 70s, and then Daniel, who's in the 70s and 90s, the classical pianist. Again, it was like this desire that was unfulfilled.
And then we talk about the way people connect. So there are sexual connections across generation. There's the musical connection. And I think that's a lot of what the book is about. But what I was interested in when I was reading this was that you're a poet and you had to convince us that these guys were talented, that they made good music. It was powerful music when they played together, they connected. And you had to write lyrics, which are not exactly the same thing as poetry, right? Like I always thought when people say Dylan's a poet, Bob Dylan or Suzanne Vega, you really got to hear the music with it. Or if you gave me Ramones lyrics, they wouldn't sound like much, but they sound powerful when they're with the music. So how did you approach writing lyrics as a poet, writing your first published novel? What was going through your head about how you were going to concoct them?
That is so good. First of all, I had to block out my poet self entirely. The lyrics are nothing like my poetry, and for better or for worse. And the other thing I had to do was I decided not to do too much research. I decided to just channel a couple bands like the Ramones, the Boys, these punk bands that I sort of knew, and just sort of get it out quickly because I realized that
Like
you
they
know
probably did. I can't
what?
imagine. I can't imagine those lyrics came out on the Ramones, or I'd be sedated with like 4 rewrites over 8 days.
Right, exactly. And I also the one bit of research I did do, I mean not one bit, I did more than that, but Bob Mould's autobiography, which I mean he's a little past, a few years later, but it also inspired me like reading about his processes and I thought, okay, don't overthink this. Just do the lyrics.
Do you think the lyrics were ever written when they're sober? The writer is
Um,
sober.
I mean,
The
in those
punk,
bands.
yeah.
Yeah, yeah, good question. I think for some people it probably was. I mean, I think that I don't know.
It's true.
Um,
Lyrics kind of come to you when you could be taking a walk, and when you're not planning to write. Did these
right.
come to you when you sat and said, "Now I'm going to write lyrics to go in the story," or were you doing the dishes or lying in bed when you reached for a pen?
No, it was more, as you said, kind of on a walk and kind of frustrated and thinking. I decided at one point there weren't going to be any lyrics in the book, and then I just said to myself, "That's not right. It's I can't write the music and put it in a book, but I owe it to the boys. That is I mean, the band, the No Names. I owe it to them
And to
to
the reader, don't you think?
yeah, yeah, and that was the main thing that I was.
Can I
It
read a
was
couple examples of lyrics you wrote?
sure.
Okay,
Go
so
ahead.
I was trying to picture the music when I was reading this. So there's this when we first it's our first listen to this album. It's the kid puts the turntable on, puts the needle down. It says, "You thought you could alter me with your religion. God damn your God, I'm making no concession. God damn your God, I'm my own religion. I sacrifice at the altar of my own confession. I get sacrificed at the altar of violation. Violence is my religion. I was an altar boy, now I'm altered. I'm an altered boy." Now that's a little bit of a poet speaking. Now, of course, within new wave and punk and rock, there are the more literary writers like, Ray Davies or someone. I don't think the Ramones would have written
No, 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 no. And that's because I wanted to bring in. I mean, as you learn from the book, um, Mike comes from a poor family. I mean, lower working class family that's very Catholic. His mother, was always. She was a hard bitten woman, but she always did the rosary in front of him. He had to sleep when he was a little baby, sleep in the drawer next to the bed because there wasn't enough room in the house, and he was always doing the rosary, and saying that kind of thing. And so I wanted to get some of his Catholicism in, and yeah,
But what about like meter phrasing? How did you how again is this different from writing your poetry? You say it's different from your poetry. What
yeah.
and how did you have to imagine the music in your mind when you wrote it?
Yeah, I didn't have a particular tune in mind, but before I wrote it, I would like listen to a few songs, punk songs that I liked, and I would say, okay, just keep that in the background, kind of. It's hard to explain the process exactly because when you're get something in your brain and you want to have it immediate, you don't want to overthink it. And even in retrospect, it's hard to overthink the process exactly, other than to say, I said, I'm not right. My poetry tends to be much more meditative,
Mm.
much more based oftentimes in like origins and etymologies of words or whatever, and has a a high sort of lyrical quality to it. Again, much more meditative, not always, but and so I needed to erase that. So that was part of it, to not be
That's been
too.
fun. Is
Yeah,
there
it
part of your brain?
was.
Another part made me think a little more Talking Heads, because also when they're plays on words that have a little intellect to them, sometimes you have to rely on the person reading. I remember when the Talking Heads album would come out, we'd read the lyrics. They'd always print the lyrics.
Yeah,
Although if it's
yeah,
screaming punk,
yeah,
you can't really hear the lyrics in the
yeah,
club. But you
yeah.
have down
Well,
Petroleum Avenue, you come wearing all your finery to the refinery. Down Petroleum Avenue, you come in the signal red Triumph from your daddy. That's pretty good. That's a pretty good verse there.
yeah, they're again, that shows their class issues, that they were definitely attractive boys like in high school, but the rich girls, as they call them, wouldn't really have given them the time of day, and they were attracted to them but not, so they kind of are mocking them.
And then the book we're talking about is No Names. It's a novel by Greg Hewett, his first published novel after a long, successful career as a poet and a professor. And it's about a flash in the pan, intense rock group, punk group from the 70s, and how they're rediscovered by a young man in the 90s. So in addition to lyrics and capturing lyrics when you're writing a book about music, you mentioned early that you knew it was a challenge to write about music. There's a challenge of capturing sound, the magic of music and interaction, right? So I was thinking of this the whole time I was reading it, about how Mike and Pete had this incredibly close relationship at that age, where if you grow up together and have your most powerful moments together of sharing what you're facing in your life, if you're musicians, you come to anticipate each other's next move, which happens in this. They know what they're going to do next with the guitar, what he's going to sing next. And I kept wondering how you were going to capture that interaction in prose that shows, is there a scene that you can think of where you thought, this is now where I'm going to show it? Or did you think about, how am I going to show, rather than just tell the fact that these two people have a kind of magic connection with music?
Yeah, I think it happens for two times in particular. Before the band forms, when they've gotten their guitars and they've no place to rehearse. And Pete, the one guy, has been kicked off the swim team and the football team for drinking and all that stuff, but he still has the keys to the pool. So they go into the swimming pool at night.
And the sound, that was evocative, the way the sound goes against the water and the walls.
Yeah, and there suddenly, as Mike says to himself, because he's the narrator, for the first time in his life, he actually sang, that he sang out. And they look at each other and shake their heads at Pete shakes his head when he hears it, and then just gets really intense and goes, and then they sort of collapse onto the starting blocks later, and Mike is afraid they're going to get electrocuted. He didn't want to be on the starting blocks so that they'll fall in the water. But there's this sort of moment of bliss. They actually riff on a Hendrix song, and finally when it's over, there's nothing to do but the emblem of the whole thing, I suppose, is Pete stripping off all his clothes, and diving into the pool and going underwater to the other end and saying, get in, this is your Triton, get in, so he forces it. So I think that's a great example of them like just looking at each other as they're playing and getting more intense. And then the other is when they shortly thereafter, when Pete goes to the record store. Rongo is the record seller and dope dealer who owns a place called the Vinyl Heart, and he goes and he finds is given, I think, by Rongo the Ramones, and he comes in and he bursts into the room that they share, because Mike winds up living pretty much with Pete's mom and dad, and he bursts into the room and got to hear this, got to hear this, got to hear this, and so they're so entranced, and they both know this is it. And Mike says to himself, normally I would like pick up my guitar and like play along with something that I liked, but this is just too intense.
Yeah.
and so he picks up his guitar and doesn't turn it on, and just riffs a little bit without making any sound.
And I think he captured the rage of punk too, the kind of violence and drum rage. So Mike is working out his trauma from his dad committing a murder, his brother ODing in Vietnam as a soldier, and he loses it on stage. You have graphic scenes on stage where he fights with people and kind of loses control. Yeah,
and I wanted that contrast because in his life with Pete, when he's not on stage, not playing music, he's like the least violent sort of person. He's not like that at all. And then when he gets on stage, as you said, he feels his father, as in the one point when they're after his father's committed murder, he finally rejoins the band, and he just says, I feel like a voodoo doll for my dad right now, up on the picnic table playing in a public park.
Yeah, and we're talking about No Names, a novel by Greg Hewett, off on Coffee House Press. We're talking to Greg. A third issue I thought about when I read this book. I was thinking of like John Cusack and High Fidelity, and this whole idea of when people, sometimes nerdy people, when we find something in a record store, when it used to be record stores, or if you're on the internet and something, if you discover something that's obscure, it seems to be this perpetual search, really through literature of all time, not just about music, obviously, where you find that if you find something that was hidden obscure that most people don't know about it, it almost confers greater value to it. Like maybe you like an album more because this is the album that was the magic great album that only a few people still know about because it had a legend behind it. I just wondered if any of that was thinking about, if you've been thinking of High Fidelity. I'm thinking of Isaac at the used record store, just finding the other one. Ramones, everyone had that when they discovered that, but he was discovering the record that most people didn't know about, but had a history back right there in his own town.
Yeah.
But I guess that wasn't going through your mind, yeah.
It was a little bit, in the sense that I was part of the, when we're all growing up, there's this like boy culture of who knows the coolest band or the most.
Like I remember someone introduced me to bootlegs in the 70s. I'm your age. So I remember someone brought home some bootleg albums and how that felt like I liked the music more because I felt like it was unofficial,
Exactly. And it was like you were in the know.
Yeah.
Yeah. No, but that was definitely my mind. And I wasn't really one of those boys at all. I mean, I observed them and was, I felt like, oh, wow, I don't know any of that, and I felt sort of like a loser because I didn't know the coolest, most obscure bands. But
and of course, this is not a book just about music. It's about the complexities of friendship. And one thing I thought that was very interesting in the book is the way you looked at how people who do genuinely love each other. I mean, Mike and Pete love each other. They need each other, these teenagers in their life. And what you're sometimes willing to do to protect your fear of losing that person when they need to go independent. So Mike impersonates Pete to destroy his plans to enlist in the army because he doesn't want to lose in the army. He pretends he's Pete and he gets him rejected. What were you trying to go there? Because compare to lose him. What were you thinking in creating that scene?
Oh, wow. Again, as he said, I feel like, Mike's as he's doing this, he says, I feel like Lucy of I Love Lucy, except this isn't a comedy, where it's like something Lucy would do. So I wanted this scene, I think, because growing up, I was 2 years after or 3 years after the last draft. And all the older boys, you knew about this, the boy across the road from where I grew up, as people said, had his butt blown off, and for the rest of his life was, and you knew people and all this kind of thing. And so that's why I gave him the brother, and that's why the older brother who went to Vietnam, and that's why I thought that he would be horrified as he was and terrified.
I didn't even think about that. There was that it wasn't just about losing him. He thought about what happened with his brother. That's kind of obvious. I missed that one.
Yeah, and he was just afraid of losing him. And because suddenly, Pete is thinking, oh shit, our band isn't going anywhere. I'm not going to college because I've, failed all my classes. And, I guess my dad was in the Army. His dad was a career officer before, and he said, not a career officer, but in the Army. And he says, I'm going to join the Army. And he doesn't tell Mike. And then Mike discovers this, and as you said, impersonates him because they do look alike. And they're I wanted the scene not to be comedic, but I wanted it to be kind of zany. You know what I mean? It's like,
and it was.
And he says himself, this is like crazy. Who does this? You know what I mean? And he says, I feel like I'm the, and we'll maybe talk about the sexuality thing later, but he says, I feel like the jealous girlfriend. You know what I mean? That's how.
And that's whether he wasn't aware he was gay in this. But he comes back. This is a coming of age story too about his sexuality, and
yeah.
And that's a whole different aspect of writing a book about the late 70s when this was still a very different world from we have today. Although we might be heading back there a little bit, but
yeah. Especially for especially in those days, the first kids that I knew to come out just after high school were not the working class kids from high school, and some of them came out later, you know what I mean? But it was just like this.
Well, here it's where those people in Amsterdam get them to film a pornographic scene for money.
In Copenhagen,
yeah, Copenhagen. I'm sorry, Copenhagen, and that's when they have the interaction they would, sexual interaction they would otherwise have. It's kind of painful and poignant.
Yeah, and I guess that's the other zany scene, along with the impersonating in front of the sergeant who's supposedly enlisting Pete when Mike does that, and then this porn scene that they get involved in and all that stuff, and they even had sex with each other, but then they're given some money to do some porn and blah blah blah.
So Greg, you started out this book knowing it's a challenge to write, especially as a poet, to capture both the lyrics and the sound of music in a book. What did you decide when you were done? How easy or hard is it? And did you feel, what does it take to do that? Did you learn anything from the process?
I did. I learned that there's a difference between, I didn't want it to be, this is going to sound weird, I didn't want it to be too novelly. And so maybe that was the poet in me coming out. So in a sense, we've talked about song lyrics, but in some ways I've realized, actually from reviewers like yourself, that it's a lyrical novel as well, which doesn't focus as heavily on plot, and on these intricate social scenes where, drawing room scenes, for example, or dinner parties, or things that it's really a lot about their consciousnesses. And I realized that I was intentionally, except for the crowd scenes when they're performing, most of the scenes are two people together, right? And exploring consciousness, and images are important, and consciousness more than straight out plot, I guess. And I learned that was me. That's who I was. Mm-hmm. And funny, when you sent the note, the invitation to be on the show, which was great, I kind of thought you were talking about lyrical novel too. And so I quickly, and I teach literature, so I kind of had an idea. So I looked it up, and the oddest thing was a book came up by Princeton University Press by a guy named, I can't remember his name exactly, but it was Ralph Friedman, and it's called The Lyrical Novel. And it's about the three writers who formed me as a teenager if I was going to be a novelist. And it was about Hermann Hesse, André Gide, and Virginia Woolf, who were like my favorite novelists. And so it was so weird. I don't know if I misinterpreted your note, but
I was thinking more of the lyrics, but I hear what you're saying about the book itself.
Yeah. And so this idea of this lyrical novel, and I realized, there's this book by Princeton University Press about the lyrical novel, and it's pretty much the three big writers in my early youth. My youth as a pre-novelist.
And Greg, what's your next novel you're working on? What's that about?
It's called The Mason's Apprentice, and it is about a Danish Mason's apprentice and how he gets mixed up with this American hockey player who goes to Denmark.
Oh, so you're big on Denmark. You spent a lot of time there?
I lived there for a few years, and it keeps...
So you can set the scenes there. Well, anyway, thanks so much for making time, Greg, from Ireland, to chat with us about your book. The book is called No Names. It's written by Greg Hewett. It's Coffee House Press. Highly recommend it. And good job on the book. Cool thing to be doing. And thanks to Harry Droz for working the controls. We're going to take it out with the Afro-Semitic Experience, performing I Wish I Knew How to Feel to Be Free from the group CD, A Plea for Peace. This is Paul Bass inviting you to fly free with us all day, all night, and all weekend long at WNHH New Haven's home for community radio.